I have been very much looking forward to hearing our next speaker, Sister Dianna Ortiz, who is an Ursuline sister. She comes from Kentucky, that's her home state. John Porteous has been trying to get Sister to come to New Zealand for the past nearly 3 years, but has been, until now, not able to get her to come out here. She's been so busy with a schedule that keeps her focused on what has become her life's work, about which you will hear in just a few moments. But Sister has come to Auckland almost directly from Reno in Nevada via Los Angeles. She arrived here at 4 o'clock this morning, and there isn't a great deal of her. She's a tiny little, so she's remarkable stamina. I want to say, I was looking at some notes that I had, and it's very difficult to say too much about Sister Dianna, just to focus you a little bit. In a program note I had, Sister Dianna Ortiz has an indomitable spirit. She stretches human understanding of the capacity for a person of faith to find purpose, goodness, and hope in the face of overwhelming odds. Some of the detail that you have in your program notes will tell you something about Sister, and she will expand on those herself. So I'm just going to, before introducing her, refer you to the last paragraph in the program notes, where it is quoted. "Part of my determination is to prove to my torturers that they have not destroyed me. They have not destroyed my will to live and to help those who suffer oppression. My faith calls and demands of me to live out the gospel, and sometimes that means speaking truth to those in power." This is a truly amazing, amazing woman. Ladies and gentlemen, Sister Dianna Ortiz.
Nobel Peace Prize winner Albert Schweitzer once said that at times our light goes out and can only be rekindled by a spark from another person. And today, as we're gathered here, women, men, and yes, children in more than 150 countries around the world are being tortured. Here at this convention, I ask a favor of each of you. May I ask that you be a spark for those who are being tortured in dark and secret prison cells around the world. In a few moments, Len is going to be lighting a simple candle. And as he's lighting the candle, I invite you to look at it and remember that those who are being tortured are ordinary people, not very different from many of us in this convention. They are students, mothers, religious leaders, nurses, plumbers, theologians, farmers, electricians, attorneys, and even children. It is true that some may be troublemakers, but please remember that some people's troublemakers are other people's human rights activists. All of us are human beings. All of us are created in God's image. No one should be subjected to torture, not even the perpetrators themselves. I also bring to our sacred circle the architects of torture, those who design and give the orders, those who perpetrate this crime, those who manufacture and profit from the implements of torture, and all others who conspire in this crime against humanity. May they come to recognize the evil they do not only to those whom they torture, but to all humanity, to all God's people. And may they resolve to abandon their evil and take up the cause of the Gospels, the cause of truth and justice. And most importantly, may they come to recognize that what they do to others is thereby done to God. I wish to thank John Porteous and Bill Moyer and all the organizers of the Eucharistic Convention for inviting me to share my reflections with you. I am both honored and extremely humbled to be in your presence. I thank each of you for being here. Your presence for me is a reminder of God's presence in our midst. I must tell you that I stand before you with profoundly mixed emotions. Grateful to be here, and at the same time, overwhelmed with a deep sadness, a sadness that is rooted in knowing that in a few short moments, I will be unveiling a dark part of my life's journey. My experience of torture, my arrest, the physical and psychological torture I suffered, and finally, my escape. In preparing my thoughts, I searched for a way to place this reflection within the context of Eucharist. And I found myself asking, what does Eucharist mean to one of Christ's followers who was savaged in a dark prison cell? I'm told that growing up Catholic and being a religious sister, the Eucharist was central to my life and to my vocation. I say, as I was told, because as a result of my torture, I suffered memory loss. After my escape, Everything, everyone was unfamiliar to me. Even that which had given meaning and direction to my mission. That which had given, which had given meaning and direction to my mission in life, and most certainly the Eucharist. I do not speak as a theologian or an expert on the teachings of the church, but rather as one who is trying to find her way back into the church community. Daily, I seek to further resuscitate my lost and tattered faith. My renewed understanding of the Eucharist comes not only from relearning the history, the structure, and the function of the church, but by immersing myself in the sacraments. I dare to say that all of us here share a common belief. Each time we come to the Eucharistic table, something that cannot be explained in words happens. The transformation of bread and wine into the blood of Christ, into the body of Christ. I certainly cannot explain it myself, but I do know the power of that miraculous moment. Eucharist, as I have come to experience it since my torture, is not only the celebration of the risen Christ, but the one who creates community, the one who calls into existence the possibility of the impossible, the one who with nail-scarred hands breaks the chains of oppression, whether visible or not, the defender of justice, the great I Am, who brings life and light into the midst of the death and darkness we ourselves have created. In Eucharist, I believe we become part of a community that God has called us into being out of hopelessness. Thus, we are called to look beyond our crabbed, narrow, individual world and to embrace a larger community, one in need of hope and healing. In his book, Torture and Eucharist, John Kavanagh writes that the Eucharist, as central to the Christian life, is the means by which we, individual and collective, become for the world the body of Christ. Only a few days ago, we celebrated the risen Christ. Shortly before, we remembered once again Jesus, his time on the cross. But that cross is more than a 2,000-year-old artifact, known only through the Bible and the Christians who respond to it. Daily, crosses are raised anew. Daily, others are nailed to them. It is happening even now throughout the world. It is happening in dark and secret prison cells that contain the bodies of the tortured and the screams that so often seen that only we, survivors of torture, can hear. On November 2nd, 1989, I took my place on one of those contemporary crosses. I often describe that period in my life as the darkest moment of my soul. That moment when everything that made life worth living dried up and hope disappeared from life. It's what theologian Martin Buber called the eclipse of God. Imagine for a moment the radiant presence of God. Color that blinding presence what you will. Now imagine a dark shadow falling across it, obliterating every sign of it. Hope is gone. Belief is gone. The God you once knew is dead. What you believed in is gone. Please know that speaking publicly about the horrors of torture tends to lead survivors directly back to their own experiences. Even here, in this safe and sacred ambience, the memories are returning, and I find myself traveling back in time. It's almost as if once again I am back at the site of my own torture. My torturers have returned. I may not see them, but I do sense their presence. I smell them. I hear their evil laughter. It seems as if it were only yesterday that I sat in that clandestine cell, naked with my back against the cold cement wall, pleading to a silent, deaf God not to abandon me, to let my torturers kill me. And truthfully, I don't want to go back there. But you see, I don't have a choice. Please try to understand that in that clandestine prison where I witnessed the eclipse of God, I saw the face of Jesus in those being tortured. And I made a promise to those whose screams I heard. If I survive, I will never forget you. I will tell the world what I have seen and heard. And I'm here, shackled to that promise, remembering not only those who were tortured with me, but all the tortured of the world. And now, in 1987, I traveled to the beautiful country of Guatemala to live there quite possibly for the rest of my life. I taught Mayan children to read and write and to be proud of their culture, all in the context of the Gospels. I did so in a country whose oligarchy saw the Mayan people as inferior, little more than animals. But the powerful knew this: if you teach a people to read and write, to be proud of who they are, they will assume, demand more of a society than to live in a framework of brutal oppression. And that is how a powerful government like Guatemala's can feel threatened by children, even very young children. Recall, if you will, Herod and his order to kill all the firstborn. And so the death threats started. At the time, Guatemala was in the midst of a long, cruel civil war, one that my own government secretly funded, and which resulted in 150,000 deaths and 50,000 disappeared. Death threats, disappearances, massacres, and torture were all too common. The threats I received warned that I must leave the country. Fear had clawed its way into my life and was affecting not only my sleep and my eating, but my ministry as well. And so I had to make a decision. I was so torn as to what to do. You see, it was easy for me as a foreigner to seek refuge in the safety of my own country. But what of the Guatemalans? They did not have that luxury. And then there were the children. I had committed my life to them. What would Jesus have done under these circumstances? I went on retreat to a convent in the old city of Antigua. And on the morning of November 2nd, with my Bible in hand, I went to the garden to pray, to ask God for guidance. And my Bible fell open to the words in Jeremiah. Jeremiah himself was trying to do God's work and was also facing persecution. What should he do? Then my eyes fell on his words. Y se quedó con su pueblo. And he remained with his people. At that moment, a deep sense of peace fell over me. And I knew then that I would remain with the people of Guatemala. Shortly after having made my decision, I was abducted by 3 men who were members of the Guatemalan security forces. I was put into a police car where I was blindfolded. I was taken to a clandestine prison in Guatemala City. Now, will you walk with me on that dark journey? And if you choose, Close your eyes. Try to feel what I felt during those dark moments. In that clandestine prison, I was interrogated. My torturers played what they called a game. If I answered a question in a way they liked, I would be allowed to smoke. And if I didn't answer the question the way they were pleased with, I would be burned with a cigarette. These were their rules. For every answer I gave, they burned me. When I returned to the United States, a doctor found 111 second-degree burns on my back alone. That's how I know they asked me at least 111 questions. I was beaten, and I was tortured psychologically as well. I was lowered into an open pit filled with human bodies. Bodies of women, men, and children, some alive, some dead. I remember that there were rats feasting on their bodies. I was also forced to witness and participate in the torture of another human being. All of this happened in '89, and still the memories are as real to me as they were on that November day. Worse than the physical torture was hearing the screams of others being tortured. It's not easy for me to admit that I was also gang raped. I sometimes blame myself.
If only I had fought a little harder. I really did. But in the end, my torturers were far too strong. The policeman was the first to rape me. And after all these years, I still carry his words when he had finished with me. He said with absolute pleasure, "Your God is dead." His words are like thread permanently stitched into my skin. The policeman, however, had left out one important fact. With God, I too had died. And dying with me was my trust in the human family. I died that day only to be forced back into life. Throughout this horror, my Guatemalan torturers said that if I did not cooperate, they would have to talk with Alejandro. And at the time, I assumed he was another Guatemalan. However, during my last few moments in detention, I met this man whom my torturers referred to as their boss. He was tall, fair-skinned, and spoke halting Spanish. And he had a thick American accent. His English was American and flawless. When I asked him if he was an American, his answer was evasive. "Why do you want to know?" Imagine what went through my mind when I learned that my own countryman was the boss of my torturers. Alejandro told the Guatemalans that he was taking me with him and ordered me to get into his Jeep and said that he would take me to a friend at the United States Embassy who would help me leave the country. And during the ride, he instructed me to forgive my torturers and said that if I didn't, there would be consequences for me. He reminded me that my torturers had made videotapes and had taken photos of the parts of the torture that I was most embarrassed of. He said that if I didn't forgive my torturers, he would have no choice but to release those photos and tapes to the press. He also told me, referring to the death threats, we tried to warn you. And as the Jeep became held up in traffic, I jumped and ran. I jumped out and I ran. And since my escape, I have tried to stop running. I wanted to put the past behind, to simply forget, but it wasn't that easy. In addition to dealing with the trauma of torture, I couldn't forget the American, Alejandro, who was able to go in and out of a Guatemalan clandestine prison and who was directly involved in torture there. Some people have said Alejandro did not physically hurt you. He took you out of the prison cell. Incredibly, I was even told that I should consider him my knight in shining armor. It's true that Alejandro didn't hold the burning cigarettes that were used to brand my back over and over again. He didn't join with the 3 Guatemalans in gang raping me. And he wasn't in the room when they forced me to hurt the innocent woman. But he was their boss, and they followed his orders. Not for a moment do I believe that Alejandro was going to take me to a safe haven. Why would I believe him? How could I? I am convinced that he had other plans for me. Those plans included taking me to another clandestine prison where it might have been easier to dispose of me. I had seen too much. I was a witness, not only to torture, but to the fact that an American was the boss of a Guatemalan torture squad. I was a threat to him, and I had to be silenced. After I jumped out of the Jeep, I had no idea where to go. I was a stranger to the city, but I knew that if I had remained with Alejandro, I would have been tortured again, and as much as I wanted to die, I just couldn't endure more torture. I remember feeling the burns sticking to my clothes. I felt like my skin was being peeled. My entire body throbbed, but I kept running. And suddenly, there stood an indigenous woman. Apparently, she saw that I was in terrible need, and she reached out to help me. She took a tremendous risk by taking me into her home. She comforted me, wiped my tears, and gave me the little money that she had in her possession to take a bus to a travel agency where my passport had been placed for safekeeping. The indigenous woman told me that she had heard that an American nun was missing, and she realized that I was that woman. For me, the indigenous woman will always personify Our Lady of Guadalupe. And I'm glad that she's with us. Eventually, I made my way to the Merino house, thinking that I would be left alone there. However, my return became quite public, and the Guatemalan National Police were demanding that they question, that is, interrogate me. Remember that one of my torturers was a policeman. Fearing not only for my life, but for those who had anything to do with me, I sought refuge at the Papal Nuncio. And for a moment, I felt safe there because I had been assured that no one would be permitted to talk with me, to interrogate me, or to even see me without my consent. And as long as I kept my distance from others, no harm would come to them. Recall that I said that I died on November 2nd. Yet, paradoxically, at the same time, it was the day of my rebirth, the beginning of my reconstruction. I returned to the United States utterly convinced that once I told my government what had happened, somehow I would have my old life back. But it didn't happen that way. I honored my promise, and foolishly I believed that my government would stand up for the truth and demand that Americans, those like Alejandro who were involved in torture, and those who knew of its practice and approved of it, would be held accountable. What must I have been thinking? I had to be silenced even in my own country. Both the Guatemalan and US governments launched a smear campaign against me. First, it was said that I had not been tortured at all, that I was part of some political plot to deny the Guatemalan military funds from the United States Congress. The difficulty with this charge was that I had more than 111 cigarette burns on my back and elsewhere. And so the story had to change. I still had not been tortured. The burns came from, and I quote, kinky lesbian sex that got out of hand, unquote. And so the words my torturers drummed into my head had come true. If you survive, no one will believe you, no one will care. Accepting the advice of many people, I continued my quest for truth by following the proper channels. I traveled to Guatemala several times and gave testimony despite the danger. And in 1995, I learned that the Justice Department had finally begun what it called a serious and impartial investigation of my case. And putting aside my feelings of mistrust, I took the risk of working closely with government investigators. And this entailed being interviewed by them for 40 hours, having to relate in detail the humiliation and cruelty I suffered at the hands of my torturers. Once again, I was accused of lying. They interrogated my friends and my family members and generally made it clear that I was the guilty party. Added to the pain of remembering and reliving the events in such detail was now the pain of being re-victimized. The investigators recreated the dynamics of my torture. It took me a long, long time before I could accept
that justice in the United States, as in Guatemala, was a mirage. My government cared more about protecting the torturers and their American boss than those who are being tortured. In the midst of dealing with the smear campaign, I couldn't understand what was happening to me. Like some tree stripped, grieving the ghost of her departed leaves, I was grieving the life that I had once lived, a life I could not even remember. And I was grieving the person I was becoming as a result of the torture. I was like a leaf clinging to delicate hinges, to something, to someone, to keep me from sinking even deeper into the waters of despair, to awaken me from this nightmare, to give me back my belief in God, in the human family, and in life itself. For I believed in none of it. However, I made one new friend, a razor blade, and I carried it with me everywhere I went. It was my safety valve, if you will. At any moment, I could do what my torturers had failed to do. If I could do nothing else in this world, I could at least control the terms of my own destiny. Later this afternoon, I will be sharing a little bit more about my faith and how torture shattered that part of my life. But let me close by saying that there would be a time when I would feel Jesus' hand upon me. There would be a time when I would feel the healing power of the Eucharist. But that time lay in the future. I was asked to share my story, to unveil something about my experience of torture. I would like to conclude this morning with a song that I listen to when I feel my faith threatened, when I fear that I am not worthy of being part of the human family, the Eucharistic community. This song speaks of rising from the dead and what our responsibilities are to God's people.